One of the great things about Vue.js is that it provides us with directives such as vIf for toggling the display of an element and vOn for listening to events of an element. And while the built-in directives cover many common use cases, there are additional scenarios that Vuetify has built into its library over the years to help enhance your development workflow. In this lesson, we'll be learning about some of the current Vuetify directives and taking a closer look at the v-intersect directive. Let's get started. To get started, we'll visit the docs. In the left-hand side, we'll see a directives menu. When we expand it, we'll see all the different directives that currently exist inside the Vuetify library. Let's go ahead and check out some of the simpler ones. The resize directive is used for detecting resize on the window or within a DOM element. As you can see here, when I resize the window, it automatically responds and returns back the size of the window. And using it is as simple as applying the v-resize like you would any other directive in Vue, and you simply provide it a method of your choosing, in this case onResize, which allows you to respond to the event. Another common directive you'll see is the vripple directive. This allows you to display to a user a brief animation based on where they click to show that they have interacted with an element. Using it is as simple as applying the vripple directive to the element that you desire. Now that we've looked at a couple Vuetify directives, let's go ahead and jump into a common scenario that we all are all too familiar with. In an ideal world, when a user lands on a website, all of the information they would need would always be within the display's height. However, as we all know, there's often content below the fold, which means it goes beyond the device's height. This is a problem because users are downloading information that they may not need, which leads to larger bundle sizes and slower performance. As a result, anything below the fold ends up being waste. Wouldn't it be great if we just make all of this disappear? And instead, only send down what the user needs, just like this. And when the user scrolls up past a certain point, the browser would send us a signal to let us know that the user has crossed a certain threshold. And once we receive that signal, we'll go ahead and load our additional content so that when the user keeps scrolling, they'll have the information just like before, but this time done in a much more performant way. As you might have guessed, this can be easily done with the v-intersect directive. Let's go ahead and use this in our application. In our Vuetify dashboard, you'll see that I've duplicated the row with the tables and timeline so that we could extend the content past the fold. At the very bottom here, you'll see this new component, which is the skeleton loader. The skeleton loader is a new component introduced in version 2.1 that allows you to provide users with context as to what's loading instead of a generic spinner. If we reload our app starting from the top, the problem with this is that when we inspect our DOM element, you'll see here that the div containing our skeleton loader for more content is being rendered even though the user has not approached the row with the ID below the fold. This is a problem because when we refresh our app, we'll see inside of the DOM that the more content with the skeleton loader is being loaded and rendered on the page, even though the user has yet to scroll below the fold. Let's jump into code so we can start fixing this. We'll start by looking for a row with the ID of more content, and we'll give it a vIf directive with the value of load new content, which will go ahead now and define inside of our script block in our data object. And it will be a boolean of false by default. If we jump back in our app, we'll see now that our more content row is no longer appearing inside the DOM, which is what we want. However, we still need to make it appear dynamically once the user hits the below the fold row. So let's jump back in our code. All we need to do this is locate our below the fold row and give it the v-intersect directive, which uses the intersection observer API. And we'll pass it a value of show more content, which is a method we'll define shortly. And here in the methods section, we'll define our function show more content. And since we're working with the official JavaScript intersection observer API, one of the default arguments we receive are the entries, which contain an array of the different elements that are being observed. Let's jump into the docs to learn about what properties exist on these entries. There's a lot to learn about for the intersection observer API, but I'll give us a hint and jump us to the section that we're most interested in. The property we're looking for is intersecting. When we jump into the intersection observer entry, we can find the definition here of the property is intersecting. And this is a Boolean value which returns true if the target element intersects with the observer root. In other words, whenever the user has hit that point, then it will return true. And this is exactly what we need. Back in our code, we'll go ahead and console log this. Since we only have one entry, we can go ahead and call the first element, and we'll call the isIntersecting property as we looked up in the docs. When we reload our app, we'll see that it prints false as expected. But when we scroll down and hit our intersection points, you'll see that it toggles true. And when we scroll back up, it toggles false because it's no longer being intersected. So now that we know that this is a dynamic property, all we need to do to achieve the effect that we desire is to take out the console log and to do this.loadNewContent and assign it to the isIntersecting property. And now in our app, you'll see that there's nothing below the folds right now in the DOM, but once we scroll all the way down, it appears as we want. And with that, you can get started using the v-intersect directive in your own app. Before we wrap up though, let's take a look at a couple other directives that you should know about. The mutation observer directive allows you to detect when elements are being updated on the page. This is particularly useful if you need to detect change on elements that are not within Vue's control. Another useful directive is the vScroll directive, which allows you to provide callbacks when the window or an element are being scrolled to. For example, in here, we can see inside the usage example that we can provide a selector to the directive, and then when we actually trigger the scroll, it'll actually scroll us all the way down. And this is a fairly common scenario. Finally, for those of us that want to support touch gestures on our app, Vuetify provides us the vTouch directive, which allows us to easily capture swipes. As you can see here, when I go left and right, it hides the menus, scrolling up and down, as expected. So in this lesson, we've learned about the different Vuetify directives that currently exist in the library, and we've taken a closer look at how the v-intersect directive works and applied it to our app. For more information on how to use these directives in details, be sure to check out the docs. And make sure to keep an eye on them, as the Vuetify team is always looking for ways to enhance your development workflow and may add more as time goes on. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson. The skeleton loader was introduced in version, the skeleton